my argument in the article is if you want to understand why there's such a crisis of trust and loss of public faith in universities today, it's because many Americans have a sense that universities have abandoned their part of the social contract, that they're not producing that research of full benefit to the American people, and they're not equipping our young people for their calling as citizens.
This is Roger Zakheim, director of the Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., and host of Reaganism. We're excited to have as our guest today Dr. Will Inboden. He is the Executive Vice President, Provost at the University of Texas at Austin. I had to look at my notes to make sure I got the title right, Will, because you're new in the job, or you're back to your old digs in Texas.
Yeah, that's right, Roger. Yeah, I was here at UT Austin for 13 years before, so it's really home for me. But this new job is a new one. It's a new title, so I'm still getting used to it.
Well, we're excited you're there. We love what you did at University of Florida and starting what is now the Hamilton School. Yeah. And when you're successful, I guess people just want more of you, and you were pulled back to Texas. Today, we're actually not talking about University of Florida, nor the University of Texas, or even your illustrious career inside government, outside government, the world of the academy, and elsewhere. Nor are we going to discuss your amazing book, The Peacemaker, which is perhaps one of the most heavily referred to, quoted books on the Reaganism podcast, which was Ronald Reagan, The Cold War, and the World on the Brink. So I am talking about it by not talking about it. I feel obligated there. But we're going to talk about your article in the recent National Affairs called Restoring the Academic Social Contract. And it's really the state of affairs as it relates to higher ed. Will, just give us a quick overview on what do you mean? Why did you come at it from the standpoint of a social contract? You don't normally think about that as it relates to citizens and the universities. You think about that citizens and government, perhaps. So tell us about that framing, and then what brought you to write this article.
Sure. Thanks, Roger. Of course, it's just great to be back with you. And, the Reagan Institute is, I think certainly one of my favorite institutions. You've been wonderful partners and friends over the years on so many areas of common interest and priorities. So great to be back with you here on the podcast. So the origins of this article, on one hand, it's an article I just started working on earlier this year, wrote over the course of this year, and it's just come out with National Affairs, of course, edited by our mutual friend and, the great thinker, public intellectual Yuval Levin. But as I was working on the article, I realized it's something that I've also been working on for about 30 years, right? I mean, because the origins of the article go back to the beginnings of my time in graduate school. But on the theme of it and how it came about, it began with realizing that over the last year or two, there's a lot of turmoil going on in higher education right now. Especially been on the headlines since October 7th and the campus protests, and a growing realization among a lot of the American people that, oh boy, it seems like our universities have just lost their way. What I call a crisis of trust in higher education. And we see that in the polling data and everything. And I have been living through that, right? As someone who's been in higher education most immediately over the last 15 years and leading an academic unit at Florida and now being back here at the University of Texas. But also because I'm a historian by training, anytime there's a current policy challenge, my mind immediately goes to how did we get here, right? Where did this come from? Whether it's a foreign policy or national security crisis or a broader political crisis, or in this case, a crisis of higher education. And so what I try to do in the article is trace back the origins of the modern American research university. And I have to stress research university because American universities have been around since before our country's founding. Harvard, the first one, was founded in 1636. So we've had these teaching colleges for many years. But research universities are a little bit more of a modern creation, really dating back to the turn of the century, about 125 years ago. And as I was trying to make sense of why our university is in such a tough spot right now, like I said, I went back and looked at that origins and realized that there was what I took to call in the article a social contract that was formed between the American people and our universities about 125 years ago. And the basic terms of it went something like this. The American people would give universities, give higher education a number of commitments and assets, if you will. So tremendous financial benefits, federal support for research and for student loans, favorable treatment in the tax code. Endowments being able to grow tax-free, donations being tax exempt, and so on. And the American people would also give universities significant legal protections, like academic freedom, tenure for faculty, to have the liberty to research and teach what we want, speaking as a professor myself. And then the American people would also give universities real credentialing power. We as Americans, we value a college diploma, right? It is, obviously there's a lot of meaning that goes into the diploma. The very fact of having a diploma signifies an accomplishment. It is a ticket to professional success. And then not just any diploma, we always want to know, where'd you go to school, right? And we place a certain value or cachet in the more prestigious schools. And you as a Ivy League graduate there will appreciate this, right? And so that value comes because people think it's valuable. That's part of this social contract. So those are the benefits the American people give universities. And in turn, the American people expect from universities a number of things, but it principally comes down to two things. One is that on the research front, the universities will produce research of value and use that benefits the American people, right? And that can be in the STEM fields of innovations in science and technology and medicine, so we can live longer, healthier, happier lives. And then in the humanities and social sciences, things like insights into international relations and national security, or economics and what makes for wise economic policy. Or insights into the true and the good and the beautiful, right?
Yeah.
The main areas of concern.
Classic liberal arts, sort of.
Classic liberal arts, yeah. That's what was expected on the research front. And then on the teaching front, the expectation of the American people is that universities will help form our young people, our sons and daughters, into our citizens, that it will help equip them for their calling as American citizens, as our future leaders, as those who are equipped for the responsibilities of self-government, right, in a constitutional republic. And so those were the basic features of the social contract that were formed about 100 years ago. And my argument in the article is, if you want to understand why there's such a crisis of trust and loss of public faith in universities today, it's because many Americans have a sense that universities have abandoned their part of the social contract, that they're not producing that research of full benefit to the American people, and they're not equipping our young people for their calling as citizens.
Yeah, I mean, it's this broken trust. I mean, it's been breached. The contract's been breached. And one of the things that stood out to me as we were kibitzing before getting on and recording the podcast is sort of how personal, or how you personally experience this. I mean, in no way am I suggesting that your analysis as an historian and bringing this argument forward in national affairs was sort of, colored by your personal experience, but you've lived through this. I mean, one anecdote, there are a couple I want to get to that you write about, is as an undergraduate at Stanford, and you have a professor sort of visits the class and talks about why they entered the world of the academy, and this professor talks about, well, it started in the fall of 1983. Now I'm reading this and I'm like, well, that's a great year. Inboden knows a lot about that year. I mean, that was the year in the Cold War and the Reagan presidency. And he talks about what happened. This is the professor who's talking to you at Stanford as an undergraduate. Tell us about that moment.
Yeah. Although one clarification, it was a professor when I was in graduate school at Yale.
Okay.
Yeah. Although similar things happened when I was an undergraduate at Stanford. So that's one thing I want to say is I tell a couple anecdotes in the article from my own personal experience, but there are many other similar ones I could have told. Right.
There was a doctoral seminar, even better.
It was my first semester as a PhD student at Yale. I'm a young graduate student. I'm an aspiring professor myself at the time, and of course you have to get the PhD to become a professor. And this Yale professor visits our class, and he was sharing his story of how and why he decided to become an academic. And a little more context here I should share on why this was so jarring to me is, Before I started graduate school, I'd spent 4 years working as a staff member on Capitol Hill in the 1990s, and I had really enjoyed that time as in my first experiences as a young policymaker. But I had grown, even though I was a conservative Republican then as now, I'd grown kind of weary of the partisanship of Capitol Hill.
You wanted to get away from politics. I mean, it was
Yeah, I
just
want to get away from politics.
yeah.
Wears you down some. So I thought, all right, I'm going to get away from politics, and I just want to go back to graduate school and study history and then go be a history professor. So I'm there in this, I'm just a month or two into graduate school. This professor comes to our class. He says, all right, I want to tell all of you how and why I decided to become a professor. He says, it was the fall of 1983, and I was waiting tables and tending bar in Boulder, Colorado, and trying to figure out what to do with my life. And I'm watching the evening news, and I'm just horrified to see that war criminal Ronald Reagan had just ordered the invasion of the Caribbean island of Grenada. And I was so outraged at this warmongering by our president in our country that I thought, I need to do something about this. I'm going to go to graduate school and get a PhD in history. And it was so jarring to me. Where is he going with this? Like, I don't see the connection there at all. But
by the way, the quote from the article, the word that stood out to me, which the language is, he wanted to do something to resist it.
Yes.
The venue for resistance against his opposition to President Reagan, however misguided that was, whatever he saw in Grenada, which was, a great win for the United States and Grenadians. But put that aside, his means of resistance, was to go and become an academic. And he was very transparent in terms of what he hoped to do as an academic.
Yeah. And another thing, which I didn't say in the article, I should say, is while I was quite shocked at this, the other 14 or 15 fellow PhD students in the seminar just kind of nodded their heads knowingly, like, we get it. And for a number of them, that's why they were pursuing graduate school and academia as well. And I, as I say in there, it's a very jarring moment for me, but I've heard many, many versions of that story over the years from other academics. Not all of them, right, but enough of them. And so what that I think epitomized is an entire generation of scholars who, especially in the humanities and social sciences, who pursued their scholarship as a form of political activism and almost always as a form of progressive political activism. Whereas for me, I had been going back to graduate school to get away from politics and politicization. And then I also cite in this story a current Stanford professor who has also lamented this, and she says, a lot of our applications now to PhD programs are people describing it as a vehicle for their progressive activism. And so
you cite Jennifer Burns, who actually wrote a great book on Milton Friedman. It's interesting.
Yes, that's right.
A recipient like you of the Age of Reagan book award.
Exactly.
But
She's a fantastic
I mean,
scholar.
it's like that mindset continues. But for one side of it, because you had the flip sort of, when people got wind of your political disposition, your biography, working at Capitol Hill, that was working against you. In other words, it was only one form of activism that was acceptable.
Yeah, this was again another story I tell in the article, but which was also a very trenchant moment for me, and still quite vivid almost 30 years later. Is later in the semester in that same class, the professor teaches that class, and I won't mention his name, but a self-described very left progressive, but also very thoughtful and balanced and open-minded. I want to stress that he actually remains a friend. But I was not trying to bring a lot of politics into the classroom discussions, but every now and then, if a political discussion would come up, because people in the class knew that I'd worked for a Republican member of Congress, and this guy had worked for Tom DeLay, the then majority whip from Texas. They would ask me, what's a conservative viewpoint on this issue? So I'd say, okay, well, here, as a conservative, here's what we would think about this particular issue. So the professor pulls me aside after class one night, and he's very solemn about this, and he says, hey, I need to have a frank talk with you. He said, I think you're one of the best students I've taught. I think you've got a great academic career ahead of you, but I need to warn you, you can't let anyone know that you're conservative, or you've got to be very quiet about that. He said, I sit on faculty hiring committees, and I've seen over and over again that they will not hire someone who's known as a conservative, no matter how good your scholarship is. And it was a very jarring moment. I'd had some senses of this. I knew that the academy was, pretty, politically, tilted in the progressive direction. But to hear that laid out, and he was not saying it in a menacing or threatening way. He was saying it in sorrow.
He's trying to help you. He's trying to advise
He doesn't
you.
like this. And so that again was one of those moments for me with, boy, I'm not sure I even want to pursue this academic career if that's what the cost of it is going to be. But I told those anecdotes partly because they're part of important part of my story and my thinking, but also because it takes so long to produce a new professor, right? First you have to go through 4 years of undergraduate, and then you have to do another 5 or 6 or 7 years of doing a PhD, and then maybe a postdoctoral fellowship, and then rise up through the ranks to get tenure. We are now, because we've had a couple generations of the academy being so tilted in the more progressive direction of both encouraging or welcoming progressive activism and then also discouraging or marginalizing conservative voices, we are now reaping the fruits of that. And that's why universities have become so politicized. We're downstream from a couple generations of those sort of attitudes and practices.
Yeah, and what we should talk about those downstream effects, but they're kind of going back to the social construct.
Yeah.
When you're talking about a point of view, Will Inboden, conservative, and anybody talks to you for like 10 seconds sees this is a thoughtful person that, his conservatism is highly considered and it can accommodate different points of view. I mean, like the sort of person that every parent should want their child to learn from, not because they want their child to parrot Will Inboden's point of view, but this is a critically thinking person who's compassionate and can make you a smarter, better thinking human being. But that,
well, you flatter me there, Roger. But those are things I aspire to anyway.
And you do it, and people know you just for half a second to see it. But there are also like 70 plus million Americans that also probably think of themselves as conservative, small c. Mm-hmm. And the fact that sort of this elitism, this sort of no betterism that pervades higher ed, that someone frowns upon, looks down upon, sees a threat or a problem with that many Americans. Doesn't that go to the heart of the breach of the social contract?
Yeah, no, this is a really important point. I appreciate you bringing it up this way. There's a growing sense among a significant swath of the American people that universities as institutions have just turned against their basic values or the basic values of the country, or what we used to call the American way of life. And for a social contract to be viable and to endure, there needs to be some mutual recognition between both parties to it, right? Not that you agree on everything by any means, but you need to at least be able to say, I recognize the counterparty to this contract, to put it in those legal terms. We have some basis of mutual agreement and understanding here. And when there is such a growing chasm between, what are seen as the basic values of universities and then the values of a significant swath of the rest of the country, that really corrodes trust. It frays or really damages the social contract, and that's, I think, what's underlying a lot of the tensions and turbulence going on right now in higher education. This broader national reckoning that we're having, and as someone who loves universities, I love the university I'm at, the University of Texas. I love American academia overall. I want to see those two sides come back together, right? I'm still very committed to, the renewal and reform of the university.
Well, we should talk about, and obviously that's sort of the spirit of your article. Meaning it's you offer a pathway for how we can get the social contract back on track, and yeah, you're right. It's not only the Harvards, the Princetons of the world that have engaged in this, but it's also, University of Texas, you actually have a list of faculty who are punished by university leadership or their colleagues, what you say, for expressing views that contravene progressive dogmas. Mm-hmm. And as I looked at that list, listen, I'm just a lay person here in D.C. Admire scholars, certainly scholars like you. Don't claim to know them all, but I didn't recognize most of them. And to think that there are people, that just spend a career working hard, engaging in the world of the academy that's built on sort of this ability to express your point of view. Obviously, you have to carry yourself in a certain fashion, but believing in those principles, and then they've been canceled and sanctioned. I mean, it's just and it was sort of depressing, Will.
Yeah, it was, and hope some of our listeners will have a chance to read the article, and you can see that lengthy list I included there. But the importance of that list, and is a list of faculty at many leading universities who had been punished,
including where you are now.
Yeah. The Mark Regner's case from University of Texas. It was a number of years ago, but it was one of these indicators. The point of all that is, universities are very committed to, are supposed to be committed to academic freedom and what we might call classical liberalism, like the virtues of free speech, of open inquiry, of tolerance, of diverse viewpoints, and of using reason to debate ideas and kind of have a common quest for truth there. But unfortunately, too many universities have failed to live up to our own, I won't say I'll say our, because I'm a part of this, our own ideals.
Yeah.
And that was part of what I wanted to do with showing that list, is these are all faculty whose academic freedom and free inquiry had been violated or punished in some way or another almost every time because they had questioned or contravened progressive dogmas. And so the point of that list is part of my appeal to universities, like, let's live up to our own ideals. If we're going to ask the American people to support these ideals, right, to continue giving us those protections of academic freedom and institutional autonomy, we need to show that we're being consistent about how we live those out. And again, I believe in those ideals. I'm certainly a very firm defender of academic freedom. But if we want to, a lot of the message there is to my university colleagues. We need to acknowledge ways that we have failed to live up to our own professed principles. And I think if we return to those principles and become again places of open and free inquiry and open debate and free speech within the rules of civility,
yes,
right, and peaceful disagreement, that'll go a long ways towards restoring the trust of the American people as well. But if we're seen as places that stigmatize and cancel dissenting faculty, especially if they're dissenting from the conservative end of the spectrum, that does no one any good.
Talk about October 7th and the aftermath, and given you have watched this closely, experienced it as we've discussed, long before October 7, 2023, did that surprise you? Yeah. That these universities could become work cauldrons for hate and violence and support of a terrorist organization.
Yeah, and I know you Roger, as a Columbia alum and as obviously someone who's Jewish as well, I know you felt this very, very acutely. So, in a word, October 7th, 2023, obviously the infamous date of the vicious Hamas terrorist assault on Israel. I would say the reaction of many American campuses to that was, to me, shocking but not surprising. Okay,
wow.
Shocking in terms, of course, many of the the anti-Semitic demonstrations and the campus riots and takeover of buildings and that kind of stuff is shocking and horrifying to see. But not surprising in that, in some ways, it was the natural culmination of some pretty extreme ideologies that a number of universities had been indulging, and some, I think, really harmful attitudes that many student activists had been cultivating, as well as just the double standards that universities would employ, again, about being tolerant or embracing of one set of political views, but not of another. And I think it's really important, the October 7th aftermath and all the campus unrest that we saw, for my larger argument, because that's what exposed to the country in ways that no one could ignore anymore some of the real pathologies and problems within so many universities, which Others of us who've been working within academia and are, from the more conservative end of the spectrum, or even the classical liberal one, had been seen and disturbed by for a long time, but it wasn't as visible to the rest of the country.
Yeah, it wasn't relegated to this ivory tower that we could all just sort of ignore, sort of,
Yeah.
Just say, oh, well, it's just a bunch of, academics who don't live in the real world anyway. It became very real.
Yeah, and it's a vivid illustration of the great principle from the conservative thinker and scholar Richard Weaver, that ideas have consequences,
Yes.
right? So some of the ideas, and I'll give a little more detail on this for our listeners, that had been growing in a number of university liberal arts departments of critical theory, of settler colonialism, and all that. To oversimplify these a little bit, it's a set of ideologies that divides the world into oppressor and oppressed camps, and identifies capitalist economic systems as inherently oppressive, identifies the West as a concept as inherently oppressive, identifies most white people as inherently oppressive, and in this schema, for some I think very perverse and distorted reasons, it identifies the state of Israel as a part of the oppressor class. Right, that's the key thing. Even though there's a horrible irony there, right? That Israel is the modern state of Israel is created in the aftermath of the Holocaust, one of the worst incidences of human oppression in human history, of course, to be a homeland for the Jewish people, and also, as you know, a pluralistic democracy, right? So there's I think it shows some of the perversions of that worldview, that Israel would, of all places, would be lumped into the oppressor camp. But because a subset of faculty and students and campus activists had been steeped in this ideology, when October 7th happens and this horrible assault on Israel, in the campus protests, instead of protesting against Hamas and its vicious anti-Semitism and oppression, actually turned into protests against Israel, and a number of those quickly bled into pretty ugly anti-Semitism and just attacks on Jewish people in general. And so that's the original horror on campuses after October 7th. But then related to that was the very rather supine response of so many university administrations of indulging or tolerating the protests as they take over campus buildings or shut down significant swaths of campus, preventing other students from going to campus, and are directing horrible opprobrium and smears and slurs at Jews on campus. And that was just a real wake-up call for a lot
and
of
to me, I mean, that's an excellent summary. And for just a quick follow-up on that, that famous hearing where Elise Stefanik is asking the university of presidents, sort of the response to October 7th, or is this a sort of conduct to be tolerated, and they couldn't see beyond the technicality of whatever guidance they have on what is violent, and a threat to the safety of students and what is protected speech. I mean, you've been you're in presently a position, Minister of Responsibilities University. You've been around it for quite some time. Did that surprise you?
Yeah, again, unfortunately it didn't, right? I would put it in that shocking but not surprising category. And yeah, to refresh our listeners, it was that famous congressional hearing, I think early in 2024, when the then presidents of Harvard and Penn and MIT are there. And, Congresswoman Stefanik put some pretty blunt questions to them, and I'm paraphrasing here, but some of the effect of, is it against your campus policy to allow people to call for the extermination of the Jews and the annihilation of Israel? So, something along those lines. And instead of just clear denunciations of anti-Semitism by those campus presidents, they gave these kind of lawyerly evasive responses.
Yeah, I think it was like, if you use the language of whether calls for genocide of Jews, I believe, kind of constitutes a violation of their bullying and harassment policies, and. Yeah. It was so technocratic that it revealed the lack of common sense and any moral compass. I mean, that's what I heard about this. I don't know if you've heard this, Will, but I kind of tempted to ask you this in question form, but I won't. I believe that exchange between Congresswoman Stefanik and the University of Presidents has had over 1 billion views on social media.
Oh, wow.
B with a billion.
Wow.
You think about, like, behold, what
That's a whole nother meaning of the word viral, going
Yeah,
viral.
yes, right. But it tells you something that
Yeah.
sort of the just the common person sort of sense, like, could you believe that they were unable to see good from evil, right from wrong?
Yeah, and that's where, it's important to appreciate, I think, the gravity of that moment and why her questioning was so effective and why the university president's responses were so dispiriting. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about the hypocrisy question,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Because, most people watching that know that if the question had come about, a victim group, more favored by progressives, if you will, there would have been, very clear denunciations, clear unequivocal denunciations by the university presidents. And look, most free speech scholars will tell you that, these can be kind of hard issues, right? Of where does it go from being protected speech into harassment and conduct, right? But it was the hypocrisy, is the sense that, over the last, several years, in the wake of George Floyd or COVID or, with other issues, university presidents had been, all too quick to come out and issue, stern denunciations or moral proclamations. But when it comes to something like, a genocide against the Jews, they were treated lawyerly waffling. And
The
and that was
lawyerly
the sense of,
waffling, that-
universities are just not being consistent.
Yeah,
They're not being
I think it's hypocrisy. I think that's part of it, but that's actually not what got me. And I'm kind of curious about this. It's actually just, are you kidding me? You can't simply state that this is bullying. Like, you didn't have to know necessarily, Will, that the universities had failed, right, to regulate, or so we're so hyper vigilant to regulate speech on the other side, right? You didn't have to be aware of instances of hypocrisies on the part of any of those universities that those presidents represented. All you had to do was just watch that moment and hear Stefanik say, hey, if students are chanting genocide of the Jews, is that bullying and harassment? Mm-hmm. And you're like, of course it is.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, to me, it's just defy common sense. It kind of goes back to the trust that your article is getting at. How do you have an agreement with these people that simply cannot distinguish between right and wrong, between speech that is clearly meant to bully and intimidate? In this case, it's anti-Semitic hurls, and they're getting lost in the sort of the small print of whatever guy that, as to your point, some lawyer wrote for them however long ago. I mean, to me, that's just the basic common decency seemed lost with the people who lead what we thought of our most illustrious academic institutions in the world.
Yeah, and it goes back to the point we were discussing earlier about it just very vividly revealed this kind of chasm between, ordinary Americans and our representatives in Congress and universities. And it was very sad because you realize these university presidents have been inhabiting these academic bubbles for so long that they have just, kind of in a lot of ways lost touch with, the basic, values or ways that, most other ordinary people of goodwill, people of conscience, ordinary Americans would answer such a question.
Let's just shift. Go with the remaining time. I want to return to how to restore trust, and talk about how governments have gotten involved. And here I'm not just talking about the Trump administration at the federal level, although definitely want Will Inboden's hot take on that, but also what's happening at the state level, which you've also seen up close. But you have a very important section in this article called STEM and the China Problem. Again, we're with Will Inboden, Provost at the University of Texas, discussing his article in National Affairs. And as we're discussing this whole dynamic in higher ed, you couldn't keep the foreign policy out of it, Will. So your expertise and experience betray you here. But there's a very important sort of dynamic that the academy that's infected the academy as well, in addition to this sort of intolerance for other perspectives and a monolithic form of thinking that we've been discussing until now, and that is how the People's Republic of China has penetrated universities and what it's meant and why it's contributed to this breach of trust.
Yeah. Yeah, this was in a lot of ways one of the hardest sections of that article to write, but also I think one of the most important. And to give our listeners a little bit of context, the crisis of public trust in higher education and this broken social contract has multiple dimensions,
Yep.
right? It's not only about let's say kind of more progressive activism within the humanities. That's a part of it, but there's also I think as we've seen with many headlines over the last couple of years, a growing realization along a lot of the American people that many American universities have forged these deep, close partnerships with China, and of course that means with the Chinese Communist Party, which controls all meaningful aspects of life in China, and this has been especially acute in the STEM fields, that sort of science, technology, engineering, and math, right? Or sometimes medicine. And again, remember, one of the features of the social contract, why the American people have been supportive of billions and billions, actually, if you added up trillions of dollars of federal support for university scientific research over the decades, has been the understanding that scientific research will produce benefits and breakthroughs for the American people, right? Well, and and the shorthand is a lot of our STEM research has been producing benefits and breakthroughs, but a lot of those benefits have gone to China instead. And this is because so many universities have forged these deep partnerships with China. They've gotten significant research funding from China. They've done exchanges and joint research partnerships with China. They've brought lots and lots of Chinese students and scholars to study at American universities. And unfortunately, some subset of those, unfortunately, the Chinese Communist Party, especially its intelligence and military services, have used that access to American universities to glean, trillions of dollars worth of American technology that they have not just put for the benefit of China's economy, but for the benefit of China's military and intelligence services. So we have, in that sense, universities have unfortunately and rather, in a lot of ways unwittingly, been helping to strengthen the military of our most significant peer competitor now and adversary.
It's unbelievable. You reference the China Select Committee's work in the U.S. House of Representatives. You talk about some of the investigations coming out of our federal government, CIA. I mean, but it's tied to the social contract because you say that part of what the university is supposed to do is teach students the values of citizenship, and give meaningful, useful research to the nation. And you end this section. A great line, it's a great line. This is disturbing. It's the corrosive irony of the social contract is this: the U.S. government's massive support for academic research originated at the outset of the Cold War, which you know more about than almost anybody, in an effort to counter the Soviet Union. You're right, but now the system of federal research support has provided substantial benefits to America's adversary in the new Cold War with China. And this is also something you had some personal experience with in terms of how brazen the PRC is. You are bringing in speakers, victims of human rights abuses from China, how the universities have failed to allow those speakers to proceed. And while they'll cancel certain elements of American society from speaking, they will sort of bow to the Chinese masters in terms of canceling others that we should hear from, and particularly in terms of on the human rights side.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to say there. And again, I will start with saying I'm glad that you referenced the China Select Committee in the House because, of course, our some two good friends of the Reagan Institute, Mike Gallagher and now John Milinar, have chaired that committee and done an incredible investigative work on this problem. And I cite it in the article. But and this is where I really want to draw an important distinction. I do in the article, but I can't stress this enough. I want American universities to be very welcoming to a lot of people from China, right?
Yes.
I mean, especially Chinese scholars who are who just want a better life for themselves, who want to be able to enjoy some of the freedoms we have in the United States, including the freedom to criticize your own government. And this is a great service that universities can perform for the country, and certainly be a real help to some of these really wonderful and brave Chinese scholars. But we also need to appreciate that, at least, some subset, we don't know how many, but it's been a meaningful one of the Chinese scholars coming to study at American universities have been doing so in the service of Chinese intelligence, and some of them actual, Chinese intelligence officers, right? And not only have they been using their access at American universities to, pilfer American technology and send it back to Beijing, but a number of them have been sent to spy on their fellow Chinese students, right? And so I, encountered this when my wife, Ronald Inboden, who's known to many of you at the Reagan Institute, a great scholar of human rights in China. Over the years, when she and I would try to bring a Chinese dissident or political activist to campus to give a talk about human rights abuses or lack of freedom in China or the dissident movement, there would be tremendous, pressure put on the guest speaker. They'd be getting anonymous calls, or we would hear from Chinese students on campus, "Hey, I want to come to that, but I'm being watched by my government." And some, other students here on campus are informing on me and my family back in Beijing. And so we realized, well, even here on American campuses, a lot of the Chinese students were fearing for their civil liberties and their freedom. And so, and again, too many universities have not done enough to protect the rights and freedoms of their Chinese students here, and so that it was just another example of how pervasive Beijing's influence operations and efforts have been on American campuses.
We're with Will
and too many universities have just looked the other way.
We're with Will Inboden, who's discussing his recent article in National Affairs, Restoring the Academic Social Contract. He is the provost at University of Texas at Austin. Will, you have seen sort of the restoration, or the beginning of the restoration of the social contract in pockets of our country. You're working at the University of Florida. Now you're working in Texas and elsewhere. You've been right in the heart of it with the establishment of what was the Hamilton Center, now the Hamilton School, University of Florida. I'm not talking about the Trump administration's work in terms of the suits against the universities that have failed to comply with the Civil Rights Act and dealing with anti-Semitism on their campus. I'm talking about the states that have basically looked at universities in their states and said, we need to fund more. This is my words, not yours. People like Will Inboden, get more academics in there talking about classical liberalism and American civics. Talk about that just for a minute in our remaining time.
Yeah, and this is where I think it's an exciting opportunity particularly for public universities to help be leading the way on a national reform effort and on the restoration of this social contract. And so and even though universities do and should enjoy quite a bit of institutional autonomy, just about every public university, there's a reason we're called public universities, right? We are funded by the states that we live in. Our charters are largely written by either into our state constitutions or our state legislatures. Our governing boards of regents or trustees are usually appointed by either the governor of the state or the trustees, and so we are more responsive to the governing structures in our states, and we've had what I think is an overall positive movement of a number of these state governments saying, well, let's create new academic units within our flagship universities. So this has happened at Arizona State, University of Florida, University of Texas, University of North Carolina, Ohio State University, University of Tennessee, to name a few. Create these new academic units that'll be focused on the principles of the American founding, the traditions of Western civilization, civic thought, this broader civic mission of helping form our students into being citizenships, and also can be units that are going to be restoring important but rather neglected fields of inquiry, such as diplomatic and military history, or political history, political theory, or traditional study of English literature such as Shakespeare and Milton and Dickens. And I think it's entirely appropriate for state authorities, if there's what they see as a missing part of the academic mission. Kind of like if a state legislature wants to create a new medical school because they think that there's a need for medical education, that's entirely appropriate. I don't think it violates academic freedom. Well, if they see some gaps in, humanities and social science curriculum, they can create these new units too. And so it's been an honor to be a part of that, both for the University of Florida and the University of Texas, the two I'm most personally familiar with. And in those places, you're seeing, the hiring of new faculty, the creation of new majors and degrees, the offering of new curriculum, and you're seeing, here's the encouraging part, tremendous student interest.
Yeah, I was going to say, there are a few metrics here in terms of success, and I think hiring a faculty. I mean, at one point, you and I were talking when you're at the University of Florida, like, you're a full-time HR, you're hiring so many people, right? And there were lots of academics that they weren't necessarily conservative, but want to teach us stuff and didn't have the opportunity because they, their expertise wasn't in some sort of, identity political slice of some broader project. Actually, they just want to teach classical liberalism, and you were given the opportunity. But actually, the part that I really love is the number of students enrolled. Talk to us about that. Meaning, the students are voting with their feet.
Yeah, no. So just at the University of Florida, in just 2 years, the Hamilton School has had over 3,000 students enroll in its classes. We've got similar numbers here at the University of Texas with our School of Civic Leadership. Tremendous student interest in and the other schools have seen the same thing in taking these classes. And again, these I try to stress in the article and reinforce here, these are not conservative indoctrination projects, right? The answer to campus left-wing indoctrination is not right-wing indoctrination.
Just more speech, more diversity.
Yeah, more speech, more diversity. It's returning to these principles of classic liberalism and classical liberalism and free inquiry. And even I make clear that we shouldn't be having political litmus tests in hiring. But as I put it, these schools don't discriminate. They don't regard being conservative as disqualifying for an applicant. And unfortunately, as I shared earlier, that previously has been too often the case with other academic units. And so just by kind of that more level playing field, you're bringing a broader range of perspectives into the classroom. And I think they're off to a really promising start.
Last question we bring into sort of national politics, but the Manhattan Institute, in its publication, recently ranked the best universities in the United States, and I believe University of Florida ranked number 1, University of Texas at Austin number 2. The common thread through both is one Inboden. They didn't write that, but that's my commentary. But it's quite remarkable that 1 and 2 are the state schools that have done and focused on education in the way that we've been discussing. It's a Manhattan Institute. It's conservative, so people, not necessarily listeners, viewers of Reaganism, but may roll their eyes or just say, of course. But I think the other thing that's going on here is, there's actually meaningful because of loss in teaching education that's going on in what we previously thought of, what are the elite institutions from the Ivy Leagues and elsewhere. Columbia University made a deal with the Trump administration. Penn, the same. Harvard's still litigating. How important is it to sort of resolve this and perhaps take a look at Columbia's agreement with the Trump administration? Do you think that will get them back on the map if they can compete against Inboden affiliated academic institutions, be it University of Florida or University of Texas at Austin?
Yeah, well, again, I will take no personal credit for those rankings, but I will say one thing I really appreciate about the Manhattan Institute City Journal rankings is, for our listeners, take a close look at them, because what they are doing is they are ranking these universities on academic quality, right? They're looking at, student selectivity, research output, student outcomes when they graduate, very important indicators for the quality of the education you're getting. But also they are looking at, things like campus climate, protections for free speech, faculty viewpoint diversity, and it's showing that there's a connection between those principles and academic quality.
Great point.
And rigor and output. Yeah. So it's not just, how many conservatives do there happen to be on campus? So I think it's a really positive model.
Okay, and then give me the hot take on: do you think Columbia is on the road to getting towards what you're seeing on these campuses at Texas or Florida, or do you think the Harvard approach? I mean, how do you think it's going to shake out for the Ivies?
Yeah, it's hard to make any predictions about any individual university, but let's say a few, general principles and observations here. The best path is, the most ideal path is certainly for universities to kind of take it on themselves to reform themselves, right? And especially have their boards get involved in saying, okay, we need to take a hard look at ways we may have drifted here and reform ourselves. But that doesn't always happen, and the Trump administration has certainly provided kind of an outside shock or some more leverage and pressure on these universities. I understand where a lot of that's coming from. Some of the particular measures the Trump administration has employed wouldn't be ones that I would necessarily recommend. But my interest is more, how did we get here, and what can the universities themselves do to right the ship? So
let's wrap up here with our lightning round. We've had you do this before, but your encyclopedic knowledge of President Reagan and his time in office and public life makes me confident that we'll get a nice Inboden twist here. So this is where we ask you for your favorite Reagan speech, quote, book. Of course, Peacemaker has already been stated, so we can go for another great Reagan book. What do you got, Will?
Favorite Reagan book I always want to cite it's actually a 2-volume. It's Steve Hayward's classic, The Age of Reagan.
Yeah.
Right? It is so magisterial. I relied on it so much in my own work, and it captures Reagan as a man of ideas, but also situates him in the context of his time and looks at domestic policy, economic policy, and foreign policy. So,
Any quotes top of mind for you today?
Yeah. So, I always come back to the Westminster
There
Address.
we go. I knew you were going to go there.
Yeah, I know. But hey, at least I'm consistent, right? It was my favorite one. One I've been coming back to a lot, particularly as we think about, kind of the troubled state of democracy around the world, is that reminder that regimes planted by bayonets don't take root, right? And of course, it's a wonderful pain to self-government, to the aspirations for freedom that I think it does reside in every human heart. Obviously, it's a complicated landscape there, but particularly thinking of that speech, its importance for helping birth the National Endowment for Democracy, IRI, and NDI, the others. I think President Reagan was really ahead of his time with that one, and I hope it's something we can still take inspiration from.
I agree, and I think we need to continue to work to make sure that that's understood and continues to be advanced both in Washington, D.C. and across the country. Dr. Will Inboden, thanks for coming back on Reaganism. Always a great opportunity to learn from you.
Oh, always great to be with you, Roger. Thanks so much.